All right, good morning, everyone. We're not going to say anything that we don't want recorded, so all of the good conversation has to stop.
So just before we begin again, raise your hand if you have something to say and to be acknowledged, and then be respectful of others and let's stay on topic. That's a challenge for us, but
Yes.
it's all right. Let's begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the world, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to engage in the words of Torah. Okay, Rabbi.
Amen. You can hear and see me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Nice
good.
joining us. So
Very nice. Okay, we are on page 28. And the Israelites are murmuring again. This is going to happen over and over. I believe Marcia is not here yet.
No, she won't be able to be attending. She's not feeling well.
Okay, so she's doing a one of the upcoming sessions.
yes,
Which is going to be on Korach,
right.
and that's also about murmurings. But God takes these murmurings very seriously, and these groups are generally going to be expelled from the congregation, but not like today where you just get a letter. There, it was like the earth swallows you up, so it's pretty permanent. It's not like you're going to come back a couple years later and ask to rejoin. So, we've gotten much more civilized about these things. So there's lots and lots of murmurings. And it's interesting because the perspective, Marcia's been corresponding with David Frankel, our previous scholar in residence. And I was surprised because in the book of Numbers, which is what she's going to be teaching in 4 or 5 weeks or less, he sees the book of Numbers presenting Korach in a very negative way and saying Korach is just kind of pretending to give certain arguments that really what he wants is just to take over. But then in a later email to her, he says, but in the book of Deuteronomy, they present Korach in a more positive light. So it's very interesting. These kind of fights, a lot of it depends on your perspective. They're not really about the issue. So Bernie and I can be in a big fight, and if there was a way to actually adjudicate the issue and bring photographs and have expert testimony, we might figure out who was right, who was wrong, what the actual situation is. But very, very rarely is that really the main issue in these kinds of contexts. It's all emotions and friends and enemies, and it's all very personal. So the fight has very little to do with objective circumstances. At least that's my position. Okay, before we get into things, let's see if there's any brief and pointed comments, particularly pointed comments, meaning that you're actually making a specific point on what we've read or on the Parsha as a whole.
Well,
Evelyn.
it seems to me that the Israelites have very selective memories in terms of what they remember fondly being in slavery and what the situation currently is. Instead of being grateful for being fed and watered in the desert, they remember fondly, quote unquote, that they had fish and meat and that they were well treated. And yet when you stop and think, they were slaves. I mean, how well treated were they? And did they have all of this wonderful food available to them? If they were slaves, is it likely that they were well fed? They had to be fed enough to be able to be workers. But more than that, they didn't live in luxury. And yet when they were grousing, it seemed to me that they, as I said, it was selective memory. And it is a human trait to always wish for something that you currently don't have. And I think it's human nature. And so you'll always look, or the grass is greener on the other side, always. And so this is what they were exhibiting as a human trait. And the fact that God took his vengeance out on them for disobeying him, I guess we can look at it and say God wanted them to be obedient to him, and here they were acting like recalcitrant children. So I don't know, human nature being what it is, I think they were behaving like humans. And so was God justified in punishing them as severely as he did?
Okay. Thank you, Evelyn. Other comments? Bernie, Pam?
Well, I don't blame the Israelites for complaining at all. I mean, this was supposed to be a short trip from slavery to the promised land. This was supposed to be, when you look at the map, this should have been fairly quick. And here they are, they go somewhere, they stay there a year, they go somewhere, they stay. I mean, I'm surprised they were this, frankly, I'm surprised they didn't riot.
So Pam, if your yeshiva Bacher husband says, let's go for a 1-week trip to St. Petersburg, it'll be interesting. And then you get there and he says, well, we may spend 3 years wandering around Russia. You would be upset.
Yes.
You would murmur and
yes.
All right, well.
We would be with you for marital counseling.
You'd be we could do it on Zoom. And Dave said, but it's nice here and we got a good deal. And so it was a 3-year trip and I thought it would be great. I thought Pam would like it. And she said, you told me 1 week. All right, so Pam understands the Israelites. They were sold a bill of goods. They said, we're going to the Holy Land. We're just driving through Sinai. And then suddenly it's more than a year ready, and there's no end in sight. And it's actually going to go on for another 38 and something years. So you have reasons to murmur. Donna.
Yeah.
If you were there, would you be murmuring, or do you think they're ungrateful? Evelyn says that you could see that they may be a little bit ungrateful. Pam says they're in shock.
But God took care of them the whole way. He fed them and gave them food and whatever. But as Evelyn said, they were very human. God gives us a lot of things and we murmur against it because it's not what we want. And that wasn't what they wanted. Even though that is what God wanted for them, that's not what they wanted. And so they're very, very human in that respect. And as Pam said, it was something that they hadn't bargained for. And that's true. But it was what God gave them. So like we are today, we want what we want, and sometimes what God wants us for us is not always the same thing.
Steve.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, the Israelites were promised the promised land. But then again, what else were they promised? And what were they to expect on this journey of 40 years or so? What were they expecting? That's the question. And I think the disappointment there is obviously right there in front of them. So, comments.
Well, I guess they were expecting a quick trip from slavery to liberation. Okay,
more
other
than-
comments?
But more than that, I mean, they were promised, and then, but they didn't know what to expect. What was promised, and then they were disillusioned by all these other things that they had no idea as to what was coming.
They were promised the land of milk and honey, but what's the land of milk and honey? What does that mean? And what did that mean to the Israelites? Obviously, not what they wanted. Again, it is what they wanted, what they were expecting.
Well, they weren't expecting all these armed tribes in their way, and
No.
they weren't expecting that the actual land of milk and honey would be filled with hostile groups. So, but I guess isn't that life? I mean, pretty much every job I've ever gotten, it turns out that they completely and totally lied about what the job was. And so in writing frequently. And so they say, the job is this and our situation is this. And you get there and you start digging around, you see none of it is true. You buy a house and, that's a little harder to do because there's you do a inspection, but they at least try to say it's something other than what it is. And you said, it's a old house from the 19th century with a lot of character and nooks and crannies. And then your inspector comes back, well, the nooks and crannies are already occupied by thousands and thousands of little bugs called termites who've been living there for years. So it wasn't exactly a lie, but they didn't tell you the whole truth. So isn't that life? I mean, life is about, I guess, the buyer beware, and that you have to anticipate that what you're actually coming into is not what you expect or not what you've been told. Even if there's sincerity and they say, this is our situation, it's one person's perspective, it's maybe filled with a little bit of hope, but it's probably not, very accurate. Evelyn.
This is slightly off from what you were just saying, but human beings thrive on challenge. If life is too good, they begin to exhibit traits that are undesirable. Whereas if they're challenged, they have a goal. So can we say that God, in a sense, is challenging the Israelites to prove their worth, that they are worth being a chosen people by overcoming all that he throws their way, in effect?
Yes, I think that's true. I just saw an article this morning that the children of billionaires you saw that article, face a lot of challenges because when you're raised in a home where you have everything, even if your parents try not to spoil you, quote unquote, you still grow up in a home where everything's there. So you don't have a challenge because you're not trying to accomplish anything because you've got everything. And you feel guilty or a sense of shame that you're not worthy of this. And so it makes it very hard.
But don't these quote spoiled children also have a sense of entitlement that it is owed to them? And so they don't feel the challenge as such. They feel that it's coming to them. So when you look back on the Israelites, well, if God promised them this, then why aren't they entitled to have the good life that they expected to have when they left slavery?
All right. Well, Pam was promised a very luxurious week in St. Petersburg, and she gets over there and her husband says, no, it's a 3-year roughing it trip. So it's like, I didn't agree to that. And you're my husband. It's one thing if some travel agent we don't know fools us, but I expected you to know that you would need to tell me that it's 3 years camping out in the wilderness in Siberia in the freezing cold. You know, that's not something you can just keep to yourself. So,
You had a point with us.
let's say again.
Bert, I'm trying to listen to this. I don't want, who is that?
I'm sorry.
Uh,
I had to mute her,
Oh, no.
Lorraine.
yeah. Rabbi?
It's okay.
Yes.
Yeah, then, well, I just lost my train of thought. Is it possible that the Israelites did not realize what the agreement was with God when God made them the chosen people? Did they misunderstand each other?
Yeah. Well, that could easily happen, right? When God gives the 10 commandments, he only gets through the first 2. They can't bear it. They said to Moses, you talk to God and just tell us what he said. We can't bear to hear God speak directly. So clearly there's plenty of room for misunderstanding. Yes. In both directions, but especially what God is saying, the Israelites probably don't get. And that's part of the problem with all this fighting, is that if you don't understand what God is telling you, then people are going to interpret it different ways. But that's part of the charm of it, right? We want to interpret it. We like that Judaism is something you interpret. If it was just God said it's very clear, then it's like the military. You don't interpret what the chief of staff, the head general says. It's clear. You just, on D-Day, they said, jump off the boats and run towards the shore and shoot the Germans. It's not, you don't have to sit down and have a discussion. What does that mean? You jump with your gun and you start running through the water. And if you get shot, you get shot. So, I like that it's more interpretive. Okay, let's start. We're on page 28. Perek Aleph, responding to murmurings and complaints. Do we have a reader? Minya. Good morning, Minya.
Good morning. Just after the people of Israel are liberated from Egyptian slavery, they approach Moses with complaints about conditions in the wilderness. Moses responds by requesting God to provide them with water and food. They are given manna each day with a double portion on Fridays, so they will not have to work at collecting it on the Sabbath. Fresh water is also supplied in abundance. Now, 2 years later, after receiving the commandments at Mount Sinai and building their sanctuary, the Israelites once again raise their voices with bitter complaints. They protest about the living conditions in the desert. As a result of their behavior, God punishes them with fire throughout the camp. Seeing this, Moses intervenes and the fire ceases. The complaints, however, are just beginning. Joining with the non-Israelites who have accompanied them out of Egypt, the people wax nostalgic, deceiving themselves about the conditions under which they had lived in Egypt. If only we had meat to eat. We remember the free fish we used to eat in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Now our stomachs are shriveled. There is nothing at all, nothing but this manna to look to.
Okay. Thank you, Minya. The cucumbers were those little thin cucumbers that taste very good. Today, I think they call them English cucumbers, but then they called them Egyptian cucumbers. So,
I think they're Persian now.
okay. So,
A question, please.
yes.
Yeah, just saying.
the statement that there were non-Jews, non-Israelites that were accompanying them. Who were these non-Israelites, and were they part of the Israelite social fabric, or were they separate? What was their role? Is there any information on that?
Well, it's the Erev Rav, and they're well known in much of the biblical narratives in different places. They're mentioned a lot. I mean, I'm just, giving you a, impression that, they were not Israelites, but they wanted to be part of the Israelites. So they were trying to blend in. Basically like today, where we have people that kind of, don't officially convert, but they kind of join the congregation and do all the stuff we do, but they never go through an official conversion. And so I presume that they were like that. But they varied, and now, of course, it's easy to blame them for some of the problems because, they're not really officially Israelites anyway. So you figure if there's a problem and they're involved, then you can blame most of it on them, which may or may not have been the case. But I'm sure they varied, now where did they come from? What groups were they? Were they Egyptians? Were they other foreign groups that were living in Egypt? I don't know, anybody else want to try to respond to Evelyn? Pam.
I always assumed that they were a group that wanted to leave too, but they didn't want to go. They'd rather go with as part of a larger group. Same numbers. That was always my thought.
Okay. Kind of like we always wanted to tour Russia, but we didn't want to go by ourselves. Now we hear the Katzes are going. We'll join them and go together. So yes, so that could also be. So that's quite different. So if we accept Pam's interpretation, they're not trying to join the Israelites, they're just trying to come along with them. So that would make a difference, because then they're not really part of this whole relationship with God. They're not really, they're just separate. On the other hand, if they're separate and they're just coming along, they really can't complain because, they're not part of the plans with God. So if God promised something, it wasn't to them anyway, because they're just kind of coming along. So I think that there could be some of both. There were some people that wanted to be part of the Israelites, some people that just came along, because they were waiting for a bigger group. Some of them were looking to practice monotheistic Judaism. Some of them were not. It's an Erev Rav, a mixed group. So there was all different types, which makes it hard to characterize them. But probably in reality, there were 2 or 3 or 4 main groups, main types. But, David Frankel would know more about that. Bernie, comment about Erev Rav, about this group that accompanied the Israelites? Okay. Sai? No. Lorraine? No. Okay, Minya, back to you.
Interpreters of Torah asked 2 questions about the grievances and grumblings of the people. What caused them, and what might have been an appropriate response by Moses? Rashi offers an excuse for the people. He suggests that they are exhausted from their first 3-day journey. Upset, even angry that Moses is pushing them along and not allowing them time to rest, they raise their voices in protest. Cranky and tired, they whine like children, recalling easier times when all their needs for food and comfort had been provided by others. Nachmanides agrees with Rashi. He explains that the people have justifiable reasons for their complaints. Moses has taken them from the familiar surroundings of Mount Sinai, where they had camped for 2 years, to a desolate wilderness where they are uncertain about the future. Frightening questions confront them. Are they safe from enemies? Will there be sufficient food and water? Who will provide it? Their anxiety is painful. It confuses them. All their murmurings, says Nachmanides, grows out of their mental anguish and self-pity. They react like others under duress and compulsion. Nachmanides, however, does not offer his explanation as an excuse or justification for the people's reaction. Instead, he sees self-centered demands as a lack of faith. He condemns the Israelites for their refusal to trust in God. Rather than giving thanks for all they enjoy, they are ungrateful, even disloyal. Instead of trusting that they are in safe hands with Moses and God, they gripe about food and offer false and exaggerated comparison between their lives as slaves in Egypt and their existence as a free people. Fixed on nostalgic and erroneous perceptions of the past, they become mired in bitter criticisms, making them incapable of sharing a vision and strategy for their future. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch offers a different viewpoint. The Israelites, he argues, suffer not from nostalgia, but from boredom. All their needs are met. They enjoy a near perfect situation in the wilderness. Each day they are given manna and plenty of fresh water. Nothing is lacking. Nevertheless, comments Hirsch, they feel themselves buried alive. The people, he continues, were as if in mourning over themselves. They look on themselves as already dead. With all their needs met, their Torah given, their sanctuary complete, their lives offer them no compensation, remain worthless and without meaning in their eyes. Frustrated at having no new goal, challenge, or mission, they begin murmuring against Moses and God. Hirsch imagines them saying to Moses, "It is not nourishment that we lack. What we lack are the tasty, stimulating foods that excite the appetite. We miss the change of diet so necessary for health. The complete monotony, the unvarying sameness of our food makes it unbearable." The Israelites, Hirsch maintained, are desperately seeking a way out of boredom. They want excitement, stimulation, and variation of foods and experiences. Their complaints to Moses evolve from their need for new challenges, visions, and opportunities.
Wow. So it sounds like they were booked into a 3-star all-inclusive. The food is adequate, but the same thing at every meal. And you can eat as much as you want, but it kind of all tastes the same. Not terrible, but not delicious, not much spices. And they're rebelling. But all right, I don't really go for this last explanation, but let's hear some people here. Pam, you, Sai.
Maybe his mic's not on.
We can't hear you, Si. You're not muted, but I don't know what the deal is.
He's still talking.
His mic must be off.
Yeah,
Okay, we can't hear you, Sai. Sorry. Can't hear. Okay. Joan, if you can hear us, can you help Sai to somehow connect his microphone? I guess you can hear us, but we can't hear you.
Mhm.
Okay, anyone else while we're waiting for Sai to reestablish contact?
Well, okay, I still feel that God and Moses and the Israelites, the Hebrews that left Egypt, are not in proper communication with each other. God has obviously not been able to communicate to the group what it is that he wants, or if he did completely communicate, they didn't get it. And so I think that's partly their discontent, the fact that they're not exactly sure what are they doing in there and where are they going and why. And so I think the fact that they are left puzzled is what causes the discontent,
Mhm.
just as a human reaction.
Barely.
Barely, okay.
Okay. Is Cy back with us?
He's,
Okay, so,
he's back,
so
but he's-
Evelyn's, so repeat your last sentence, Evelyn.
That God and the Israelites did not completely communicate well with each other. God did not make his goals known to the Israelites, and the Israelites either misunderstood or didn't get enough information so that the two of them were in commune with each other.
And this is a problem today as well. I mean, with employers, employees, it's very rare that there's a good communication, especially at the beginning. So the company's trying to hire a CEO who will accomplish certain deeds, and they hire somebody who looks good, and 3 years later, everything's a mess. And the CEO's working very hard, and he doesn't understand why they're not supporting him. And they're puzzled why he's doing everything wrong. And so a lot of it may stem from a inability to communicate clearly. You know, so this is a problem that continues to this day. But, you know, God tried to communicate, but, you know, it's hard. How does God communicate with people, and how is that? How do you make that clear?
I have a question now.
Yeah.
He did not communicate with the Israelites. He communicated with Moses and
Okay.
expected Moses to communicate. So
Right.
is it God's fault or is it Moses's fault?
Well, God tries to communicate with the people directly a little bit, but you're right. Most of it's through Moses. Moses stutters. Moses, and in my view, Moses was an Egyptian who didn't really speak Hebrew. So, which is, if Marcia was here, she would raise her eyebrows and say, Rabbi. And but Moses is not the one to communicate for God, because Moses has his own communications issues that are pretty severe. So there's problems, you know, the communication, and you know, I guess we can't criticize God too much because we have these problems among ourselves. We should be able to understand each other better than God understands us. You would think we're much more similar, you would think, but we communicate worse. Is that fair, Steve? Okay, Minya.
This is Mike, it's a question, I guess. What do they do all day? When they were slaves, they were busy. Now they're wandering around in the desert. No wonder they're talking about being bored. So being bored gives them plenty of time to think about what they're missing or what they think they're missing.
Right,
Or
right. Well,
memories.
they're not really you know, there's periods where they're trekking, but most of the time they're not moving anywhere.
But what
You know,
are they?
they're not
What do they do
constantly.
all day?
Well, you know, they spent many years, this is not yet, but they're going to go to Kadesh Barnea and spend many years basically in this little town. According to this, they spent 2 years at Mount Sinai. So they're not spending they don't get, for 40 years, they're not getting up in the morning, picking up their tents and hiking 8 hours a day. They're just staying there. So yeah, that's why, who is it? Nachmanides and Rashi say that they're complaining because they're
Bored.
bored, right? Or
Yeah.
is it Samson Raphael? Samson Raphael Hirsch says that they're bored.
Yeah.
It's not about nostalgia, but it's boredom. Okay, so why are they bored? They're not doing anything.
Right.
They're in the desert. They're not hiking. If you want to keep people from getting bored, you get them up in the morning. You create work. You pick up your tents. You pack everything up. Spend 8 hours hiking, and move them left, move them right, move them around, and then they're exhausted. I mean, someone asked me a few weeks ago why there's so much anger. Actually, he's a Jewish guy that I met in the biking, the Sun City Cycling Club. And he's active in the HOA or the Rec Center Board or one of these groups. This is quite interesting. And we're on the bikes, and he says, why are people today in America so angry? And why are they shooting people? And part of the reason is, I remember my mother's parents, they had a window washing business, and they worked all day really hard, and they had kids, and they had, they were busy all the time. They barely had time to stop to rest. So Moses needed to keep the Israelites much, much, much busier, even if it's just make work. Hiking is a great way to tire people out, but they didn't. They sat around in the desert. There's no swimming pool. There was no gym. There was no movies. They're bored out of their, and the food is the same manna over and over. They're bored. And if they're bored, they're going to complain, of course. And they don't have control over their itinerary. It's like you go on this, a trip, but you're with a group. So you're in Paris and you want to just walk around the cafes and the streets. And the tour guide said, no, back on the bus. We've got to see a cathedral. But I don't want to see a cathedral. I want to walk around Paris. Sorry. So they're stuck. So yeah, I guess I agree with a lot of the things he said, but on the other hand, it sounds so trivial, they're complaining that the food, it doesn't have enough variety, and they're complaining about that there's no cucumbers. All right, come on, get over it. So I don't know.
Can you hear me?
Did Sai ever get back?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
What I'm curious about is the writers of the Torah. Why would they write about this particular thing? What does that have to do, in my opinion, with God? I mean, this is what the Torah is all about. And why would they include a story like that? What does it do for you with your relationship to God? I don't understand that.
Well, Sai, do you want to start answering your own question?
I mean, that's one of the problems I find in the Bible. There are so many stories that have nothing to do with anything. They're just outside stories. And, that's what we're doing now. We're acting as psychologists rather than studying the Bible.
So, so this has to do more with the Israelites rather than with God. But it affects God's communication with us. If the Israelites at the time of the revelation couldn't understand what God wanted, it justifies us not understanding what God wanted, does it not?
I don't know.
Anyone else? Answer Sai's question. Why the emphasis on Israelite psychology rather than on God, and stick to the theology? Stick to talking about God, not about why the Israelites want cucumbers.
But the Torah is also about his people, and he's forming his people. this is the beginning of the Jewish people and their relationship with God, which continues on into today.
Uh-huh. So, the Torah is not about God. The Torah is about the covenant
I
between
didn't say
God.
it wasn't about God. I said it wasn't just about God. It was about his people with him.
Okay, Donna said that, but I'm going further and saying it's not about God. It's about the covenant between God and the children of Israel. But I'm not
Okay.
quoting that. Donna, don't blame her.
But I'll buy you too.
But so, Shai, would that explain this? That the whole point of the Torah, or at least this section of the Torah, is to try to explain the relationship.
Is that one of the main reasons of the Torah? To try to explain that, or is it a set of rules set down?
Well, that's a
And the
good question.
rabbis afterwards were trying to explain it, because in a lot of cases, didn't make much sense to them.
Well, the rabbis try to explain it, but clearly the original editors of the text had very different views. The rabbis just come along, ignore what the editors of the text and the writers of the text intended, and they come up with their own meaning, what the purpose is. So I'm not overly concerned with what the rabbis thought. Those rabbis, what myself, then that would be better.
Hmm.
Comment, Sai, or others?
I don't think you can separate human behavior and the relationship of humans to God. They are interrelated. Humans have evolved with the various emotions and personality traits, some of which are good and admirable, and some of which are not. And so it is the relationship between man and God's laying down certain rules of behavior to help humans better live with each other, essentially. To me, this is one of the basis of the 10 Commandments, that humans would not function well with each other. They'd be killing each other, raping and pillaging and everything else, which is what they did and still do. So that in order to have a human society that functions in a constructive way, you need these rules and regulations. And so, yeah, there is a psychological slant to it, and I don't think you can get away from it. I think that it is critical and necessary to understand the relationship between God, the Torah, and the Hebrews at that time. Do I make sense?
Interesting. Pam?
Well, what I like about the Torah is it shows us that human nature has not changed.
Yeah.
Over the many, many, many years. People still are acting like the people, that we're reading about. And, and God is still sticking with us despite this. But yeah, that's what I think what the Torah is showing us. Things are not changing. Some basics, human nature is still there.
And that's comforting to you?
Yes, because there are no surprises.
But there are surprises. People will behave in very erratic ways. My dogs were complaining about that a few days ago. They're saying we're very consistent in our behavior, but you people are very erratic. It's very hard for us to predict how you're going to behave.
Yeah,
And
you
that's
have great
not good.
conversations.
well, but it's true, isn't it?
Well,
So, I mean, you have, you read about it in the papers all the time now. Somebody walks up to somebody else, pulls out a gun and shoots them for seemingly no reason. You know, the erratic behavior is, and you know, we were afraid, you know, some gunman who's a deep, committed, hating anti-Semite would come into our synagogue and shoot a bunch of us. But now we see almost every day people go into post offices and country music concerts and shopping malls, you know, where there's the people there are random and shoot them. You know, it had always seemed to me that a shooter would shoot people that they hated, you know, that there'd be a long history of anti-Semitic screeds on his computer, you know, that sort of thing. But most of these shootings there's people behave very erratically. And isn't that upsetting? Isn't that, I mean, I don't know. When we could predict that people will behave on the basis of ideology, you can then plan. When people just behave in such random ways, you can't plan. No, am I wrong, Pam? All right, back to you, Sai. So if you were rewriting this section of Torah, you would stress, what is God? Who is God? What does God believe? What does God want? And leave the Israelites pretty much out of this.
It doesn't look as if he heard.
It goes back to all these old questions. For example, why did the Holocaust happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? And we keep asking these things, but yet under the surveillance of God, they still continue to happen. So what's the point?
All right, so getting back to the Israelites, the Nachmanides seems to say that they had a high anxiety, they had high mental anguish, and they had high self-pity. Where Samson Raphael Hirsch seems to say that mostly it's boredom. So Evelyn, which position do you agree with?
I think there's a little of both. There's never a complete right or a complete wrong or a complete one viewpoint. There's always an element of all of these elements in the situation as such. And so maybe some were bored, but on the whole, again, I still feel that the Israelites did not have a sense, God had not, or Moses had not imparted to them this divine thought that they were the chosen people. They were going to go to a land where they would be happy and live happily ever after. I don't think they envisioned that at that particular time. And so this is why you had discontent, that they didn't see what the final goal was.
Okay, anyone else? Is it anxiety or boredom that's producing this sort of behavior? Nachmanides or Samson Raphael Hirsch? Pam?
I think a little of both.
That's what I said.
Okay, well, we're not going to get any choices made here. Okay, let's move on to Pinchas Pelli on page 30. Whoa, whoa, oh boy.
Rabbi,
Yes.
let me just back up just a minute and just say that what we've just been talking about. Interesting that Israel is the same today. The problem is there. People are being shot, people are being killed, the enemy is coming in, and so you know, it's life goes on, and it has ever since the Torah.
Yes, some father of two was shot, you know, in a terrorist attack yesterday.
Yeah.
Okay, Pinchas Pelli, page 30. Who'd like to read?
Okay, I'll read it. Pincus Pelly echoes Hirsch's viewpoint, but turns it critically upon the Israelites. Bored with the affluent life, they are seeking ever new thrills and new cravings to titillate and stimulate them. Too demoralized to look towards the future, they turn to the past. Their memory is very selective indeed. They do not remember the torture and humiliation of slavery. They do not remember the joys and excitement of liberation. All they remember is the fish they ate in Egypt. Hilly's point is clear. Like Hirsch, he believes that the complaints of the Israelites rise out of their dissatisfaction with the near perfect status quo of the community. What remains unclear is whether Pelly and Hirsch mean to suggest that human beings simply cannot tolerate perfection. Why did they complain? The cry of the rebels was for meat and variety, not for food as such, for there was no hunger among the people. Satiety, boredom, lack of challenge, and the inconveniences of nomad existence were seeds of discontent as potent as want and poverty. Bad will be the day.
And that's Rabbi Gunther Plaut, a German refugee who became a leading Reform rabbi in Toronto. And he basically is following Samson Raphael Hirsch. Okay, the next guy, Philip Brooks, I don't know who he is, but read that.
I'm sorry, did you say in contrast?
No, can you hear me
That
okay?
will be the day.
Yeah,
Bad will be the day for human beings when they become absolutely content with the life that they are living, with the thoughts that they are thinking, with the deeds that they are doing. When there is not forever beating at the doors of their souls some great desire to do something larger, which they know they were meant and made to do because they are still, in spite of all, the children of God.
okay, what does this mean? Philip Brooks's comment, what is he saying?
You can't become too content with with the status quo. There always should be a striving for accomplishing more.
So if I don't know any Hebrew and my goal in the next 5 years is to learn Hebrew, it gives me something to work on. And in 5 years, hopefully I will have achieved the goal, at least to some degree, but the goal is important. If I've made plenty of money and I now have a retirement home and I'm just sitting around and I don't really have any, aspirations, then, dissatisfaction will increase. Is that fair? I mean, do people here raise your right hand if you've got some goal you're trying to achieve that keeps you motivated?
Yeah, we all do.
I don't know. I don't see any hands.
Yeah.
All right, I see Sai's hand. And how many people do not have any great goal, but they're satisfied anyway? I see Bernie and Lorraine, and then the other people. Do you have goals, or do you have a lot? If you don't have a goal, then is there a lack of satisfaction with life? Like, I've got everything I want, but I don't have any goal, and therefore I'm discontented.
No,
No.
Yeah.
Okay. Go out to eat once a week, go to synagogue once a week, go to the rec center once a week, go on vacation 4 times a month. Hopefully that your husband doesn't plan a 3-year camping trip and tell you there's a 1-week luxury tour. Okay, any comments about Philip Brooks? Okay,
yeah, I think that we all have small goals at this point in our lives, depending upon our age. I think if you're in your 70s, you may have greater aspirations to accomplish something such as learning a new language or whatever it is. But as one ages, I think the desire to achieve certain goals at this point, I'm not going to go on for a PhD at a university. I won't complete it. However, there are always minor goals of accomplishment, either volunteerism or some way of fulfilling us so that we have a sense of satisfaction. Routine is good, but I think there should be always one activity that you have to work a little bit harder for. And while right now it seems today's talk seems to be essentially about psychology and human behavior, as Pam and I have both agreed upon, is the same now as it was then. Humans behaved then in pretty much the same way. Human personalities have not changed that much in 5,000 or 6,000 years. And so what was true then is also true today. And so if being sedentary, stuck in one community as they were for 2 years or 4 years or whatever it was, yes, and lacking the ability to read, lacking TV, lacking many of the amenities that we have today, perhaps there was boredom. Not completely. The women must have had sewing and chores to do. The men must have had the animals to look after. It's not that they could sit on their rear ends and just vegetate all day long. They had chores, but whether they wanted more or needed more, I suspect that they did. And this was the reason for the discontent as such.
Wow. Okay. Anyone else? Aye. Okay, then Evelyn, you can read on. We're in the right column on page 30 in contrast.
In contrast to those who explain the grievances of the Israelites as expressions of their anxiety or boredom, Samuel, who was the head of the Academy of Learning in Chaldea, Babylonia, during the 3rd century, hints at another reason. He calls attention to the words used by the Israelites in their complaint. What did they mean, he asks, when they cry out, "We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt"? In response, Samuel speculates that by free fish, the Torah is hinting at forbidden sexual relations. That's perfect. And in other words, the real complaint of the Israelites derives neither from their recollection of delicious foods nor from their boredom with manna. What they resent, according to Samuel, is the Torah's curtailment of various behavioral norms. That is, the Torah forbids sexual relations out of wedlock, especially with members of the family, including sexual intercourse with parents, siblings, aunts or uncles, grandparents, step-parents, or in-laws. This kind of regulation that would radically change their behavior, explains Samuel, is the reason for people stood at the door of their tents murmuring against Moses and God.
All right, let's stop there.
Yeah, let's. I think this man was somewhat frustrated in his own personal life and tended to attribute certain traits that really does not make sense. Pam?
Pam.
Well, first, who is this Samuel? How did he get to be a leader of an academy with this ridiculous stretch here? I don't know. He has had what my mother would call issues.
Yes.
All right, you don't think it's a legitimate point that
No,
a
no,
group that when they
it's
were
a stretch.
slaves, they were allowed to do anything they wanted sexually with whoever they wanted. And now there's all these very strict rules. You don't think that would produce any sort of backlash?
Oh, geez, just
All right, is there anyone who disagrees with that?
I would assume,
Donna, Sai.
well, I would assume that they partook of a lot of sex, if you want to call it that. And when it was taken away, vis-a-vis the Ten Commandments, they were unhappy about it. If that's true, I can understand them being a very miserable people.
So you understand that they might have really complained about this.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, which would people care more about? Sex lives or dietary variety?
Both.
Oh, sorry. Both. Um,
But on the dietary variety, they're saying, oh, for the fish that we ate in Egypt. But probably, knowing them, when they were in Egypt, they were saying, why do we eat fish every day?
all right. I mean, being a slave in Egypt was no fun, but it wasn't as bad as being a slave in the American South, for example. So it was tolerable, but it wasn't, you know, you don't have your freedom. You can't, you know, do what you want. But in some ways, there was very little supervision. You know, who cares what the slaves do at night? And Samuel is saying, you know, they don't want, you know, they didn't sign up for these strict laws, right? You've heard the joke about the commandments, right? That God was shopping them around and finding a group that would take them. And he goes to the Hittites and he says, I can give you commandments. And they said, what would be a commandment? And God says, well, do not kill. And the Hittites said, well, we kill pretty frequently, so we're going to take a pass.
Yeah, I'm in a Torah
And he
class.
goes to other groups and so forth. And then everyone says, no, I don't like it. And he goes to Moses. And Moses said, how much are they? He says, God says they're free. And Moses says, I'll take 10. Okay, I'll let Evelyn, you can keep reading about Samuel's students.
Okay. Samuel's students amplify his observation, maintaining that the people resent the manna because it identifies those who have indulged in forbidden sex. How so? The manna, they claim, fell before the tents according to the needs of each family. If a man commits adultery and a child is born, then an extra portion of manna falls in front of his tent. At that point, everyone knows that he has fathered a child out of wedlock. For this reason, the people rise against Moses. The law and manna change their way of life, forcing upon them a new moral code. They bitterly resent being held accountable for their ethical actions.
Oh my. So you have a secret love child. You send payments via, how do you say it, Zelle or Zelly? What's the new app that you use to transfer money? Anybody know how to pronounce it?
No.
Vimo,
well-
right? Vimo.
Well, this is another one. It's Zelle or Zelly, but okay, Vimo or Cash App, where you know, you've been reading about the Cash App murder. So Cash App is one of the big apps on the phone to transfer money, and the founder or the technological expert who made a fortune on that is a guy with the last name Lee, I think Bob Lee. And he was murdered in San Francisco. And it turns out he was part of a swinger lifestyle and a drug lifestyle. And he was out at 3 a.m. with the brother of this married woman, a Persian Zoroastrian woman, who he was having casual sex with at these swinger parties. And her husband didn't seem to mind, but the brother did. And the brother murdered him, stabbed him 3 times, and he died in the middle of the streets. So connects Cash App with what we're talking about here. So so this same sort of thing happens today. But people may want to use Cash App or one of these other apps to quietly send money to their, what do they call it, baby mother. In Jamaica, everyone has a baby mother, baby daddy, something like that. That's a term. You know, she was on the phone talking to her baby daddy. So it's just was totally normal there. But you don't want it to be publicly, embarrassing, so you might give money quietly. It's nobody's business. But if if you have a wife and 2 kids and there's 5 or 6 or 7 pieces of manna outside your tent every morning, everybody's going to know that there's some unaccounted for children, obviously. So is this just made up by the Samuel students, or do you think that God might actually do that? And was he trying to embarrass people, or did he just figure that's the most efficient way to get the right number of manna to the right people?
Learning to shame people or having God shame people hopefully would help them to behave in a manner that he would like to dictate to the Israelites. If they were that licentious and he disapproved of it, feeling that this was not beneficial to the culture and society, he would try and do various things, whatever he could, to make people behave perhaps in a better fashion. And so maybe by shaming them, which is one of the psychological weapons that the Jewish mother is renowned for, perhaps this would be effective. And for some people it is, but for others, nothing is going to work. So it just depends on the human individual.
But Evelyn, since the 1960s, we've been trying to get rid of shame, right? We're trying to say we should be allowed to do what we want without shame. And it seems that, religion and maybe Christianity's more blamed for this than Judaism, but we seem to have it right here that religion believes in creating shame and stigma and so forth to kind of use social coercion to encourage a certain type of behavior. And in post-60s America or post-60s the world, we're like, we should be able to do what we want without shame. And so, what is the word they have? They have a word now for people that want to have relationships with more than one person. And it's become very common. Does anybody remember the term?
Polyamory.
Polyamory, thank you.
Yeah.
So polyamory is considered now a normative concept. And they have in the newspapers all the time, there was an article about this guy and he's got 3 or 4 live-in wives. They can't be all married because that's illegal, but they regard themselves as all married to each other. And, I was waiting for a follow-up article to see how happy they are a year or 2 later, but that doesn't really prove much, right? If the divorce rate in normal heterosexual couples is 50%, then if polyamory couples split up at that rate or a little higher, it wouldn't prove that was any worse, right? Yes, Pam.
Well, as long as we have mothers and grandmothers, we will have shame.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah, Rabbi, I think the pendulum in human behavior and culturally tends to swing back and forth. Sometimes you've had periods when social strictures were very strong, thinking of the Pilgrims and earlier Protestant sects, where SECTS, where they were very strict about human behavior and sexual behavior. And then you had plenty of periods, I'm thinking of France, Louis XIV, where he helped himself to every female that was walking around. So it was, you had extremes of behavior always, but society as a whole since the 60s has swung in the way of licentiousness. I think at some point, if we ever get to the point where we have a dictator, a strong leader who says this kind of behavior is detrimental for the goals that I have set for this society, and therefore there will be marriage and no outside licentiousness at all. And so this is the period we're living in now. How long it will last, who knows, depending upon the socio-political situation of the near future. So.
Well, I was always curious why people resist so much any sort of dietary restrictions, whether it be ritual like not eating pork. I mean, what was the big deal? If you can eat most things, why is abstaining from one food item such a big deal? Or even abstaining from healthy things like no salt and not too much cholesterol. But many people, most people resist any limitations. They want to eat anything and almost randomly. It's not like they even like these things. They just don't want to be told, look at your food and abstain from something or restrict something. And so clearly there's no reason to think that in sex, people would feel differently. If I want to be in a polyamorous relationships, or not a polyamorous relationship, but polyamorous relationships with an S, I guess Bernie, would it be a singular thing?
Well, the poly takes care of the plural, I think.
Okay, so a polyamorous relationship, then I don't want anyone telling me no any more than I want them telling me I can't, eat ice cream.
Wait a minute, now you're treading on sacred ground.
Because this is the part that I was building up to. If you noticed, when we came to the food stuff, we had two views, and nobody here really wanted to choose between these views because we're talking about something that's very subtle, really not that important. The Israelites wanted more cucumbers, but I think that here we're getting to the real gist of it. It's about freedom, complete freedom. I want to do what I want to do without any limitations in any sphere of my life. And whether that's food or sex or more broadly, if I want to go to Russia, I want to go to Russia. If I want to, whatever I want to do, I should be able to do. I don't want anyone telling me no. And I also don't want to be shamed into feeling bad about it, right? So the State Department says you shouldn't go to Venezuela because it's dangerous. Well, I don't want them to make me feel guilty about going to Venezuela. So it goes for anything. I want to be free to do what I want to do without consequences and without being shamed into it by society. And I kind of feel that the emphasis here is trying to enforce conformity in behavior by shame. We're going to set rules, but we can't enforce the rules all the time. So we're going to try to shame people into enforcing these rules for us. And, but that's religion, right? And religion has a lot of good reasons for shaming people into restricting behavior. But people don't like it today. Comments? Lorraine? Minya? Okay, Bernie.
I just hope lightning doesn't strike me. since there's a fair amount of evidence that none of this really happened, I look at the whole story as an allegory. And what's it trying to teach me? And that's how I view this. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but that's a different perspective, I think.
Mhm. So your main point is that,
What is this story trying to teach me? Not that people were unhappy about eating this manna, whatever it was.
but rather,
The people weren't there. I mean, it didn't happen, in my view. So why is this, why did the authors write this story? What is it trying to teach me? And I don't know the answer.
oh, okay, you don't have an answer.
Right.
And okay, so if we presume the Israelites spent most of their time in Canaan and really weren't here for 40 years, and this story was written by editors living in Israel much later, why would they write this story? Well, one reason might be that they didn't write it, that this was a story circulating, right? People, nations have mythology. And this may have been a story that people were telling and retelling and retelling. Why did it come about? Well, it's kind of a good story. It shows, you know, when you have a strong leader, you want to have some voices for democracy, basically.
No voice.
Rabbi, you're muted.
You're muted.
I don't know.
Now
And
you're,
your question partly, Bernie?
you're muted, Bernie.
Are we all muted?
I missed most of what you said because you were muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. So if we assume that you're correct, that this was a written story, then what are the authors trying to convey by this discussion? That's the question. So I thought you had an answer, but if you don't have an answer, somebody else has to come up with an answer. I mean, if a goal, one of the goals of religion is to help us enforce proper behavior, then we want a little bit of shame, right? If you're ultra orthodox and you believe in monogamy and only monogamy and having 11 children, then you need a little bit of shame. You can't have the neighbors, you know, in having a polyamorous relationship that openly, that would be counterproductive to forcing people or pushing people into a certain mold, which is better for everybody. And in this case, especially for the children, right? If the father is having 6 different relationships with different women in different parts of the city, his time and his money and his energy is divided among 6 sets of children. And each set of children is going to suffer economically and also from the lack of parental involvement. So clearly it's better for the children, for the father to have one wife and to stay in that house all the time and not to travel around the city to 5 other different houses. So there's a certain purpose to this, correct?
Yeah.
Comments?
Well,
Help Bernie come up with a solution here.
I can.
Evelyn.
I can see why there would be laws on kashrut, because it had been known way back then that since pigs ate offal and OFFAL and undesirable sources of food, that they were unclean and that people would become ill if they ate pork that was not consumed, that was not cooked thoroughly. And as far as eating the sea life that were basically bottom feeders who ate on necrotic tissue, that they ate dead tissue, these were not desirable because they were also susceptible to more bacterial infection. They didn't know about bacteria in those days. All they knew is that if people ate certain foods, they got sick. And so the feelings were, let's say, they're forbidden because they make people ill. And so their feelings were, again, you had sheep, you had goats. These were animals that were herded and they were slaughtered in a proper way. The meat was cooked in a proper way, and they knew that the populace would not become ill because of eating these foods. So I can see where in the beginning, the laws of kashrut made sense. Today, there is so much restriction on what you may or may not. If you are really religious and you have to have a hechsher on a particular package before you can consume it, it becomes, to me, almost ridiculous that the rabbinic association has to give their stamp of approval on a particular package of food, because if it doesn't have it, then you're not allowed to eat it. I think they have subverted the whole purpose of kashrut for what? Their own economic advantage, shall we say.
Evelyn, I want every one of my members of my temple to get my approval for anything they do before they do it, no matter how small. I've got an open email account now. Before you so much as pick up a piece of vegetables in the supermarket, you email me for my permission. So, but seriously, I mean, that was a joke, obviously, but from the Orthodox point of view, they look at us as, oh, they want to follow Judaism, but they're rejecting one of the fundamental tenets of Judaism, which is there's a whole set of laws, a very rigid structure that has to be followed. So we want Judaism without the rigid structure, which to us sounds perfectly reasonable, but to an Orthodox person, it looks like we're trying to be libertarians at this. You can't be a libertarian Jew according to their way of thinking, and that's what we're trying to do. Bernie.
I have to disagree with Evelyn.
No.
About what?
About the hechsher. The reason that I view that you have the OU on the package is for people who need to be informed or want to be informed about whether this is appropriate for them to eat it, not that the rabbis need to make a profit on the deal.
But what about the broader question of...
I'm sensitized to this because my daughter has celiac, and so she has to look at the package and make sure it says gluten-free.
Yeah, my daughter does too. That's a health issue rather than just packaging something that has the kosher sign on it. I'm not talking about, my daughter is celiac also, and so she looks for gluten-free products. That is a serious health issue that is, what should I say? The rules are laid down not by religion, but by the government approving that certain foods can be labeled as such. But again, I still feel that the Orthodox have taken it to the extreme where the cans have to have the hechsher on it, and every package has to have a hechsher. You can buy fish only in a kosher food market. Meat can only be from a kosher meat market, and it's gotten to the point where I feel it's almost extreme. And so personally, I don't believe in it. My daughter does, but I don't.
So we're coming to the end, and I wanted to get a few final opinions on the broader issue. Do we want our religion to push us into certain normative modes of behavior for our own good or for the good of our society? Or do we want a libertarian Judaism where we go to synagogue and we come to Torah study, but we're allowed and even encouraged to do whatever we want in our personal life? If I want to have 6 baby mothers in different parts of the city, I can do that. If I want to become transgender rabbi, I can do that. If, and so forth and so on, whether it be with sex or in food or in anything else. A few final comments: libertarian Judaism or enforce moral standards of normative behavior.
Is it Judaism if you are extremely libertarian, as you put it? Is it then Judaism?
Well, that's what we do in our temple. That's what the Reform movement does. Okay, Bernie?
I think that there are standards and there have to be standards. So that I would step somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. That certainly we shouldn't be free to do whatever we want to do anytime we want to do it, nor should our lives be dictated every minute of every day.
So eating pork, okay or not okay for a Reformed Jew?
If you want to.
Having
But-
6 baby mothers, okay or not okay?
No, now we're getting into societal.
Transgender rabbi, okay or not okay?
Sure.
To borrow without asking somebody's car with the intent of returning it, even though you didn't ask permission.
Why does that have to be religion related? That's local law related.
Okay, Pam, Lorraine, Cy, final comments. Libertarian, Judaism, or enforce moral standards? Or now we have a third choice, the Bernie option, which is somewhere in between.
You just,
Okay, Lorraine.
You have to unmute, Lorraine.
No.
Okay. I'm with Bernie. Somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Of course, somewhere in the middle requires a lot more discussion than we have. We only have about 47 seconds left today, but somewhere in the middle requires to figure out how do we get to that somewhere in the middle place, because what's in the middle for Bernie may not be so middle for Lorraine or vice versa. So whereas if you took one extreme, then it would be a little bit easier. Okay, 1 or 2 more final comments, Donna.
I think it depends upon, this is a Torah study. It depends upon what you view the Torah and the scriptures.
Okay.
If they're
And
God's word, if they're from God, God said, don't do it. For me, that's enough. And I don't have to do that then. I don't have to eat whatever it is. And I've got a long story about that, but we won't go into it today. If it says, to me, if God says don't do it, don't do it. But he, in that process, he still took away people's, he still gave people the freedom of saying okay or not okay.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Minya or Shirley, a final comment? Okay, over to Steve, final comment, and then any announcements and summing up, and then the blessing.
Okay. Next week, Riva is going to be leading us. Rabbi, you're going to be leaving tomorrow if you get packed and Lane picks you up.
2 a.m.
Then we also have 3 other people besides myself, Marcia and Evelyn and Pam and Minya, who are also leading in the next couple weeks while you're on vacation. I don't have any specific announcements for during the summer. I know that during services, that's going to be led by members of the board, or I understand, and they encourage that people come to services at least so some support for them. Any other comments or concerns before we can conclude with the blessing?
Good
Say
luck
hello
for the
to
next.
Israel for me.
Good luck in the next several weeks, and
Thank you.
remember, you're going to be on tape.
safe travels.
Yeah. So let's conclude then with the blessing. Together, Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah
Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan
Baruch
v'chai v'tokenu. Baruch
atah
atah
Adonai,
Noten
Ein
HaTorah.
HaTorah.
Blessed is
This is
Adonai our
our
God,
God,
ruler of
ruler of the
the universe,
universe.
who has
Who
given us the
given us
teaching of truth and
planting
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 within us
within us
eternal life.
eternal life.
Blessed is
Blessed is
Adonai,
Adonai,
giver of the
giver of the
Torah.
Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, have a rest, good week, and safe travels, Rabbi.
Bye,
And
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
see you all soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good travels. Safe.